I like that. Yeah. Recording is in progress. Okay. Wonderful. All right. Thanks everybody for coming today. So this is going to be our roundtable on this new wave of Gen Z protests going around the world. So very happy to have a really fantastic panel of academic experts here to discuss this. We're going to have, I think, a pretty free-flowing, freewheeling conversation. Really looking forward to it. I'm Dan Slater. I'm the director of the Center for Emerging Democracies at UMich Democracy, and very happy to be sort of moderating and trying to supervise my fellow adults on this on this session. So let me just briefly introduce our roundtable participants and then get things started. We have a nice turnout on Zoom in addition to in person. It's obviously a hot topic. So first of all, to my immediate left, Francisco Garfias is Associate Professor of Political Science at Duke University, where he has taught since receiving his PhD from Stanford University in 2016. He studies the political economy of development with a focus on how states consolidate authority and navigate civil conflict in developing countries, especially Latin America. He has published articles in literally all the peak disciplinary journals in political science, and is currently working on a book project intriguingly entitled When State Building Backfires, which is also the title of an outstanding article he co-authored with Emily Sellers in the American Journal of Political Science. So welcome, Francisco. Adrienne LeBas is professor in the government department at American University, where she has taught since 2009. She spent 3 years up the road in East Lansing on the faculty at Michigan State University after receiving her PhD from Columbia University and completing a postdoc at Oxford. She's the author of From Protest to Parties, Party Building and Democratization in Africa, which is Oxford 2011. And she is in town, as are our other panelists, for a workshop on a new book project with Jessica Gottlieb on taxation and the contradictory logics of state building in Lagos, Nigeria. Third, Martha Wilfahrt is an assistant professor of political science at the University of California, Berkeley, where she has taught since 2018 after receiving her PhD from Cornell University and completing a postdoc at Northwestern. She studies African politics with a focus on redistributive politics, state-society relations, and historical legacies. She's the author of Pre-Colonial Legacies in Post-Colonial Politics, Representation and Redistribution in Rural Africa, which is Cambridge 2021, which was awarded the Alan Sharlin Memorial Book Award from the Social Science History Association. So we've really got a fantastic set of panelists here. Obviously, big global topic to dig into. So I'm going to turn things over to Francisco and get things started. And those of you online, please, the Q&A should be working. And so looking forward to your questions as well.
Great, thank you, Dan. I'm very excited to be here and looking forward to this conversation on Gen Z protests. I think the slides are, yeah, great. Okay, so I think we're mostly going to be sitting here structuring this as a conversation. Just as an exception to that, I will be standing up just to move my hands around this figure. Before talking about the figure that you can see here, I'll just say that when we were discussing, what would be interesting to talk about, and this Gen Z protests idea came up, immediately I think all of us, and I'll speak for myself, I was really drawn back to the news. The underlying causes of protest is something that I've been interested for a while. Back 10 years, I observed this phenomena firsthand in Mexico, where I'm originally from, and was really puzzled about why is it that protest emerges in some instances and not in others? What are the triggers that actually enable the organization of these events? And what are the consequences once they happen? My own research has gone in other directions, including, as Dan mentioned, state building. But I think the idea that even elites that are engaging in statecraft, they have to look down to social unrest all the time to inform their choices. And this is something that is very relevant today, as the title of the conversation suggests. And so going back to the news, as I said, I was struck by some headline-grabbing protest events. We have cases like the case in Nepal, Bangladesh, the region that I think I'll have more to say, which is Latin America. We have ongoing protests in Peru and some big events that occurred over the past few years, including in Chile, in Colombia. And this made me think, because some of my own work on protest is not very recent by the nature of academic research. It made me think, well, is this really an uptick? Is this a new trend in protests? And so my instinct, given the type of research that I do, was to try to go to the data to inform this intuition, right? If one reads the news, one gets the impression that this is a new trend that emerged particularly after COVID, I'd say. And we'll have more to say about what's different or not in terms of the features of protest. Okay, so there are many ways to do this. Scholars that study protest more quantitatively have a menu of data sets to try to answer questions related to this type of events. And here, just for this event, I decided to go to ACLED, which is one of the major sources for this type of work. ACLED is a collective effort that tries to code events, not only protest, but also other violent events, by using actual humans, in contrast to other projects that use AI and machine learning techniques. Now, of course, the advantage of those projects that use AI is that you very cheaply can code a bunch of different events based on new sources at the cost of committing a lot of errors. And that has changed over time, but at least when one tries to go back in time and code these events, you're likely to make this type of errors, even if the trends broadly are decent. ACLED, by contrast, has this group of RAs, researchers that go through the sources themselves and catalog them. Now, this is time intensive and of course had limited for a while the reach of the data collection. As you can see, I cut it on 2024. They actually do have 2025 already, not really comparable, given that we're still waiting a few months. But the trend, I should note from the outset, was not shockingly going upwards in 2025. To do this, what I tried to do is get within region countries that have data starting at least in 2018, so we don't have changes in the composition of the sample. And one thing to note about this data is that it aggregates the number of events. And so as you can see here, down here, we're measuring demonstration events that are public events of 3 or more people that are advocating a shared cause. That's their definition of a demonstration. It includes both peaceful demonstrations, violent demonstrations, and demonstrations that have been repressed in various ways by the government or not. Okay, so it's looking at all of this together. I should briefly note that this is in contrast with other types of events like battles, armed interventions, and so forth. Okay, so what is the data telling us then? I aggregate countries by region, World Bank region, and my first takeaway is that in general, we don't see a very clear uptick, at least across all regions, in protest, as these headlines would have us believe. We do see that some regions like the Middle East and North Africa, as well as South Asia, do see an uptick in the number of demonstrations. But in Sub-Saharan Africa, Latin America, and East Asia and the Pacific, we don't see any recent change in trends. Maybe something that had been noted before is this lull in protest activity during 2020 that corresponds with COVID, and then an uptick just following the most intense period of COVID across the world. That itself generated some motivation for protesting. Now, some of these trends are hard to see in this version of the graph, so I have just a slide adjusted graph that essentially normalizes the protest within region to have 2020 be the point of reference. And so, okay, so as you can see here, because we have different levels across regions in the number of demonstrations just based on the population in each region. This, I thought, would give us a little bit of a better snapshot of what's happening in terms of trends over time. And so what we can see here, again, normalizing in 2020, is that we do see this pretty notable increase in the number of protests in East Asia and the Pacific. Just digging into the data, that 2021 uptick is driven in part by all of the unrest that occurred in Myanmar. But again, the picture that we see in these latter years is not necessarily one of an uptick in protests. We see discontinuity in at least the number of demonstrations that have happened according to this data set. Okay. Now, a couple of caveats to note, I'll just leave this one up while we talk, is that this data measures the number of demonstrations. And in doing that, it omits the magnitude, the intensity of some of these protests. So it's going to count equally one demonstration of 15 people that the ACLED team was able to pick up, and another protest of, thousands of people that have taken to the streets. And so some of the headline grabbing cases that I think one sees when we look up online what's going on with these Gen Z protests are these massive movements that I think almost as a selection into the news have achieved already both mass mobilization and in many cases, some consequential policy outcomes. And so we are not seeing lots of reports on other failed mobilizations or smaller scattered protests that do get picked up by ACLED and that are actually reported, but they just don't come up in the headlines with these nifty adjectives. And so, I just wanted to begin with some background. As far as we can tell, this can shift as we improve the data and we see what's been going on in 2025, for example. But I think I wanted this to serve as background for the discussion that we're having. So with that.
Great.
Yeah.
Okay.
So I just want to start by talking a little bit about Gen Z. I'm going to mostly focus on Africa here, just to sort of put in perspective, I think, why this topic is so people pay so much attention, whether it's truly motivated by an uptick in protests or not. But so in Africa, the median age is a little over 19. In comparison, the median age in America is just under 40, and globally it's 30, right? So it's an extremely young continent. We can talk about what that means right now, but just looking forward, it's estimated that half of the entire world's population growth in the next 25 years is going to take place in Africa. And by 2050, it's estimated that 1 in 4 people globally will live on the African continent, right? So we talk about Gen Z, but like Gen Alpha, whatever comes out, they're going to call the generation that comes after, right? And this is a continuing trend going forward, right? That I think will continue to be of interest. So, but just thinking about Gen Z or youth, I mean, I'm going to sort of, I think, more flexibly talk about youth the way it's often talked about in Africa, which is generally defined as somewhere between 18 to 25, 30, 35, depending on the definition using. A lot of governments, we use about 35, which I think is more culturally, but I don't know if you would agree, more culturally sort of how people think about it. But when we think about youth in Africa, which of course would include Gen Z, this is a far more educated population than previous generations. So if about 1/3 of people over 50 have some secondary education, it's about 2/3 today. That's of course highly variable across countries. About 80% of Kenyans have achieved some degree of secondary education. It's more like 40% if we look at countries like Senegal or Madagascar. And I didn't look it up actually, but I mean, countries like Central African Republic, Chad, I mean, they're gonna have far lower rates, right? So there's enormous variation, but on average, it is a far more educated population. Youth, we know, are highly engaged on social media, on forming new types of online communities. They are statistically more likely to report having participated in a protest or being willing to protest. So they are politically engaged. What they are not is politically engaged, or they are less politically engaged than we often think of as normal forms of politics. So if you look at Afrobarometer data, they're far less likely to report that they have some form of party identification. They report voting at lower rates. They report attending community meetings, these types of sort of contacting, elected officials, those things, they're all, statistically less likely to report engaging in than older cohorts. But at the same time, they have real grievances. So, again, from Afrobarometer data, if you ask them what their biggest issues are, over 50% say the economy, specifically unemployment is a big issue. And then the issues that follow are things like education, health, real sort of felt infrastructure differences in their lives. And if we think, like in Madagascar, the spark of the protest was about 2 municipal councillors in Antananarivo, protesting against like lack of water infrastructure. And I think that this is very indicative of sort of the types of sparks that we're seeing happening. So people don't feel like they can, that they have upward mobility at the same time that, especially in urban settings, I think there's sort of a real growing aspiration for middle-class life. And there's, increasing income inequality that's very visible to people, right? So people both have more skills, right? They want to participate in the economy. They don't feel like there's options, and they see other people doing well. The last thing I would say is this is also a generation that in almost all countries has grown up with some form of electoral governance, right? They are not democracies, except for a few exceptions, but they have, since they were born, had opposition parties competing, even if very unfairly. Elections are held on a somewhat regular schedule. And so we can talk, and I think we will talk about like what that means for their views and understandings of democracy, but they have existed in a political ecosystem that is electoral to some degree. And so I think that helps explain some of the frustration about this sort of, there's a real demand for representation that is not, that the supply is not there. And yet they think that they're in an electoral regime, right? So that we can see where this starts to sort of form a real basis for grievances. It's not that governments have done nothing. I mean, I think from the 2000s, there's been a long concern with African population growth going back to like family planning initiatives in the 70s. And it's always been a bit of a sensitive subject. But I think in particular in the late 90s, early 2000s, you see like a lot of attention to the youth bulge and this fear that all these youth are going to be radicalized by jihadists and these types of things. So there's, long been like international concern about this growing youth bulge. But then there's also a lot of domestic concern. Politicians do talk about the youth. They're often extremely pejorative. They're children. They're very moralizing about their behavior. You do sort of see this like counter narrative of like Africa rising. Look at this, like this is so much entrepreneurial potential in all of these young people, but none of that lays out any form of policy agenda to how to get them actual jobs or integrated. Like how do you actually spark that entrepreneurial spirit? Like no one, not that positive narrative has never really been able to articulate that. And so I think there's been this sort of lurking or various forms of a narrative about a youth threat, all of which I think sort of has demeaned anyone internationally or domestically taking seriously grievances of youth beyond sort of like lip service at election times, right? And there's also like a huge voting block. And so it's not that politicians are unaware of that. And they've put out a number of programs for like, Kenyan youth work, things like this. These are, they often have very little money. They become huge clientelist machines. Who gets the money is like so-and-so's kid. They're rife with corruption. And so what response you have seen domestically has been the same old, right? And sort of further alienating to people. And so I think sort of this, you can sort of see the seeds of these grievances, right? People feel like they have gotten some level of education. It's not necessarily a skill set that translates into what jobs there are and or the jobs aren't there. You have an increasingly urban population. It's estimated to be 50% in the next like 10 years of the population is going to be urban. What programs are offered are like extremely dysfunctional for the most part. And governments are increasingly repressive, right? And really strikingly increasingly repressive. So, following Tanzania's election on October 29th, and it's estimated like 700,000 people were shot and killed. Right? It's extremely striking. Yeah, like the current estimates are like 700 to like 1,000 people have been killed. But not that, well, not that it shouldn't happen, but so these regimes, there's this flip side is they're sort of increasingly repressed. So I can say more about specific triggering events, but I sort of want to lay some background of like why we think Generation Z is distinct or might be distinct.
Good.
Maybe I can start off by, there are people in the room who probably don't know about the Gen Z protests or why we're calling them Gen Z. So maybe I'll give you a couple of examples and also talk a little bit about why we're even calling these things Gen Z. In the grand tradition of roundtable panelists, I'm going to be like, these are not actually different, even though the poster is like, what is this new wave? So the way in which a lot of people became aware of this idea of Gen Z protests were the protests in Nepal back in September. And these actually did have something that would be consistent with the Gen Z frame, which is the immediate triggering event was a social media ban. And social media bans have been increasingly being used by authoritarian, semi-democratic governments, well, authoritarian or semi-democratic or both, those kinds of regimes to an increasing attempt to actually control popular protests. So this could be seen as sort of an immediate backlash to trying to dismantle the protest mobilizing structure. But the Nepalese protesters had a lot of other grievances as well. I mean, mainly as already mentioned around services delivery, corruption. The reason this burst onto the sort of public sort of screen is, you know, they set parliament on fire. There was a lot of violence by the Nepalese military forces against protesters, but they forced the resignation of the prime minister. And right now there is an interim government in Nepal, which says that they're going to have elections in March. Who knows if that will actually happen on time. And then Martha referenced the Madagascar, which very similar, you know, incredibly dramatic, large scale protests, mostly young people in the street. There was a trigger, but again, background conditions of elite corruption, dissatisfaction with services, same response. Military, you know, shoots into the crowd, 22 people are dead. More dramatically, they brought down the entire government. So within 1 week, the president, Rajoelina, he announces that he's dissolving parliament and getting rid of, you know, the current government. And then I think 2 weeks later, he also is gone. He flees into exile and you have a military interim government take over in Madagascar. So those two, and probably the Kenya 2025 protests, which were the second attempt to get rid of tax increases. The 2024 Kenya protests, they had also set parliament on fire. They had forced the government to go back on its finance bill and its new taxes. Then a year later, they did the same thing, really dramatic photos, mostly young people in the street. So this is what these protests look like. I've cited the sort of 3 very successful high profile cases. There are a lot of others. I think the reason we're calling them Gen Z protests is because they're young people and because there is, at least in journalistic coverage of these protests, some kind of argument that these young people are able to mobilize because they're on social media and because they're using these new forms of, you know, organizing protests that were not available to previous generations. I genuinely think that's going way too far. I think that these protests look a lot like, you know, and again, I'm an Africa specialist, so also you're going to as well. So you're going to hear a lot about Africa. These protests look a lot like earlier waves of protest. So back the major austerity protests beginning in 2010, you can also think of those as food price riots. Those looked very similar. They were similarly described as leaderless. They were similarly described as mostly mobilizing young urban youth. If you go back even farther in sub-Saharan Africa, we have, again, driven in part by rising food prices and you know, discontent around economic conditions. We have a similar wave of protests in the early 1990s. Again, protesters described as mostly youth, leaderless, non-organized. And those protests actually did bring down authoritarian governments or forced many authoritarian governments to adopt political liberalization and democratic reform. So my contention would be, we have a lot of these that sort of look the same. I did want to give a shout out to Adam Branch and Zach Mamkeely, who in 2015 actually published a book called Africa Uprising. Very similar narrative of, you know, there is a new wave of protests that is leaderless, that draws on these informal networks within cities, the huge growth in the youth population. And this is gonna, you know, just transform politics. I love the book. The book is great. They really do a very good job of showing what concrete gains those protests did achieve, but they're also very careful to say this is not necessarily going to be transformative or to create democracy. So what then can we say about these protests that are different? Why is it that it seems like protesters are having a lot more success? And I would say it's because governments are really weak right now. So, you know, I think we're going to talk later about the debt crisis, the looming debt crisis that is coming, but also the very real changes in the structure of what the Bretton Woods institutions are able to do for countries in terms of public finance, the kinds of conditionalities that IMF and the World Bank are now putting in place, and the sort of, I would say, the disintegration of the clientelistic bargains that really stabilize politics in a lot of the low-income countries that I'm familiar with. So I think a lot of this discontent amongst the youth is clientelism is not working for them. They're seeing sort of clientelism continue to shape politics, but unlike older populations, they're not getting jobs. They're not getting, you know, this sort of redistribution of some resources. And instead it's starting to look a lot like sort of elite grand corruption. But also I think state institutions are just really weak. You know, we look at this wave of military coups across West and Sahelian Africa, and a lot of those did have a protest component. But also, you know, we just don't have really strong state institutions in a lot of these places. So if you push a little bit too hard, there's not going to be pushback in the way that there was in the 90s and maybe even in the 2010s. And when you do get pushback, it's going to be military response. It's not going to be, well, let me see if I can get you some goodies to take you off the street. Last thing I wanted to mention, because I feel like as someone who spent most of her undergrad career as an agronomist, I feel compelled to mention food prices in every talk I give. So I will say that the Global Food Price Index indicates that we are late with the protest wave. So the peak in the food price index was in 2022 after Russia invaded Ukraine. Food prices lead way up in low and middle income countries. Paying for food is a really large proportion of household budgets. So usually when we see leaps in food prices, you see immediate responses and protest waves. Arab Spring was almost entirely, many people would argue, a food price wave of protests. But we didn't see actually a lot of high profile protests in 2022. And now we're getting maybe not as many protests, but we're getting some of these really big mega protests now, even though it seems late in terms of food prices.
Terrific. Yeah.
So I mean, I wanna connect it, but I wanted to bring in the speaker again. Sorry, I wanna really make use of it.
Yeah.
Just since you mentioned 2022, I'll use that as a bridge to what I go to next. So thank you. So let's go on.
Did you have a food price slide?
I didn't. I was curious again
Times
about
promised than you.
yeah. I was curious about the 2022 pattern, and yeah, we do see a decline in the number of protests in a couple of regions, but a slight increase in Latin America and Sub-Saharan Africa. Well, Latin America kind of stays, it plateaus between 2021 and 2022. Anyway, so I can take it out. Yeah. I just wanted to connect it to the triggering factors, which I think is the thing we should talk about next. So just to sum up a little bit of what I've taken away from your interventions is we have this Gen Z protests that we struggle a little bit to pin down. So part of it is just a generational replacement in who turns out to the streets. A second one I would say that I've seen in the journalistic treatment of the protests is related to how they are organized. And so related to social media, but I think the additional adjective that you hear often is leaderless. So they seem to be more organically organized, and they emerge without the traditional political organizations that tend to lead protests. And I just have here, a number of examples from Latin America that speak to this, and maybe again continue in my mind with a little bit of skepticism about something distinctive in the past few years relative to what we observed in the past. And so what I want to do now, just to organize my thoughts, is first to offer the buckets of the different triggering factors that at least the media has identified as motivating these protests. And then try to take a step back and as someone who has tried to contribute to this literature from an academic perspective, just reflect on what we know from the past in terms of empirical patterns, what are the theoretical drivers of protest, and what are some of the debates, things that are still under discussion, and how they tie back to what we're observing now. So, background factors that have been mentioned include state weakness. They include some baseline level of grievance that the population has that can come from various sources. And one thing that's been mentioned is that this type of protests that we're discussing tend to occur in authoritarian regimes or competitive authoritarian regimes, not quite full-blown democracies. And I'd say my perspective from Latin America, and more broadly from our understanding of protests, is that protests happen everywhere. They may get the tag in specific contexts, but in fact, the empirical pattern that we see that's quite remarkably consistent is that we see more protest in democracy. And that sort of makes sense if we think about the costs and benefits of protesting from the perspective of would-be demonstrators. I'll come back to that. Before going to a discussion about the theory of protests, I just wanted to offer the buckets of the triggering factors that I've observed in Latin America, and maybe you can help me with things that I'm missing from other regions as well. So we have tax-related triggers. So a big tax bill that is proposed that has big consequences, that's triggering a reform. Fuel prices are a big one. So a subsidy that is suddenly removed because of some fiscal strains generate mass unrest. This may seem like a minor thing, but fare prices in public transportation, another big category in Latin America. And then, there's a mishmash of other corruption/political related factors. And so we have a big political event, a president is ousted, for example, and that generates a lot of unrest, possibly politically motivated, that then feeds into a larger movement. And so we have, the big examples without going through an exhaustive list is the case of Chile during the so-called estallido social in 2019 that was triggered by a hike in the subway. Initially, it led to rioting, which was followed by a heavy-handed repression by the Chilean National Police, and then just ballooned into this, people call it a social movement rather than a protest. It was so big that it led the government to accept essentially a rewriting of the constitution led by a new constitutional assembly. Later on, the process went in a different direction, but this was a big movement with big consequences, triggered by something as trivial as a local politician or bureaucrat deciding on the fare for the subway. You have a paradigmatic case for the tax category. I think of Colombia in 2021. There was this tax bill, this tax code that was pushed through Congress, generated a lot of backlash. This backlash was a mix of organic protesting, but also the more traditional ways in which protest has occurred in Latin America, which is led by unions. And so have big unions, opposition parties rallying people to the streets as a result of this proposed tax reform. Again, in this case, the protests were successful in some sense. This tax bill was withdrawn, and so it didn't come to pass. And there is a debate to be had about this, but it also raise the profile of today's Colombian president. So, he rode on the wave of these protests of discontent, and, together with various other factors, was able to win in other elections. And then you have the political bucket. I think an important example here is the movement that happened in Guatemala in this lame duck period prior to Bernardo Arevalo taking office. There was a move by the incumbent regime to try to stop that transition from happening, and that generated a lot of discontent, eventually again pushing for a successful transition to Guatemala's present-day president. There, of course, failed protest movements. We have a fuel subsidy removal in Haiti that led to more repression and no concessions. This is amidst a situation of extreme state weakness for the region. But there, I don't think any reasonable observer would count that as a success for the protest movement in Haiti in particular. When it comes to that policy objective. Okay, so again, taking a step back, what we have are a mix of underlying conditions related to grievances, and then triggering factors, such as this, fare hike that we see in Chile. And so this, to me, speaks to a larger debate in political science about what drives protest. And so there are various perspectives, and I won't be able to discuss all of them. There's a long tradition in sociology looking at the macro structures and windows of opportunity for collective action. I'd say, just to keep it simple and interesting, I would pit a perspective that focuses solely on grievances. Perhaps the most famous one is this relative deprivation idea, where conditions are poor for a group of people in society relative to a comparison group that they see as more privileged, and this pushes people to activate their demands and take to the streets. Not entirely inconsistent with this perspective, but sort of taking more seriously individual choices, is trying to understand protest as a collective action problem. Essentially a coordination problem where individual would-be protesters that are perhaps really mad and really want to express their discontent publicly are considering whether to join a movement, and they're weighing costs and benefits of doing that. And so if they go out and protest, they may incur a very large cost if the state decides to repress. But as the protest size increases, the probability that each individual protester is going to incur this cost declines, right? So some people may get beaten up by police or incarcerated, but if the protest is large enough, there's just no way for the state to repress an entire mass of people. And so the key dilemma from this point of view is, how do would-be protesters coordinate their action and find a way to all go to the same protest together, okay? Focusing on the logistics, the actual demands that are gonna bring the greater amount of people, in order to bring as many protesters out to the streets, which makes them being repressed less likely and makes their demands more likely to succeed. In addition, I'd say, and this is part of the research that I've done in the past, we have these new technologies that Adrienne was attributing to the Gen Z, but I'd say, having done research in the past decade prior to Gen Z, these technologies have been around for a while now. I've focused in particular in a project on cell phones, but I think the same mechanism can occur in specific software, social media like WhatsApp or Twitter back in the Arab Spring days and so forth. And the idea there is, we have an additional way of communicating among would-be protesters and the citizens at large, even those that don't participate, so that when the state actually represses, this information can travel very quickly and actually increase the cost for the state to take this action. So if everyone gets outraged by an act of repression, then more people are going to come out to the street. And so you are in this cycle in which the government thinks twice now before repressing, knowing that it is going to create this backlash potentially. And so in that research, we show that indeed the introduction of cell phone technology that enables social media and sharing of these types of repression events makes protest more likely. And it also, repression when it does occur, makes escalation more likely. And so cell phones on net make governments hesitant to use repression. That's a pattern that we uncover in data, in sort of global data, using one version of this events data sets that I showed at the beginning. Okay, but then this brings me to the final thing I want to say, which is related to grievances versus triggering events. And so I know of a really interesting empirical research that has documented how, for example, in pre-modern era, weather shocks create unrest, right? This is, I think, good evidence for a grievance mechanism. In the present day, we have evidence that price shocks, in particular food price shocks, also lead to protest. And so there is a sense that this background grievance is a necessary condition for protest movements to emerge, even if it's not a sufficient condition. And one of the puzzles in this space is, why do we see all this misery everywhere and you don't see protests all the time? You just see them in specific situations, right? And this points to some of the triggering factors that I think are so common. And I would say they're so common precisely because they enable the coordination of all of these grievances. And so you have a metro fare hike in Chile that is kind of it affects the day-to-day lives of Chileans, and some of the frontline protesters in that first wave are gonna be the ones that really are affected by this. They were youths that started to not pay as an act of rebellion against this policy, but then very, very, very quickly, this creates the conditions for a common knowledge in which everyone knows that everyone else knows that this is the event that is going to coordinate everyone. And so that's why we have fare hikes, that's why we have subsidy eliminations, pension reforms that are slashing benefits, or food prices that are pushing some folks to catastrophic situations. Those things not only immiserate the population, heightening grievances, but also provide a focal point for coordinating protests.
Can I pick up on that for a second? Because I think when we think of these things as triggering events, we think of them as causes, but sometimes they're more like occasions, right? It's sort of the occasion when something happens, and that requires a certain kind of repertoire, a certain knowledge that when, in the past, this has been the kind of thing that's triggered, triggered some kind of protest, so people sort of know this. So I wanted to push you guys in a couple directions. These are all really, really great comments. Lots to think about. So I was really struck, Francisco, with your comment at the beginning when you put the slides up and you said, governments are looking at social unrest all the time. They're always thinking about social unrest. And I think it's really a vital point, because, we tend to think that protest is very, very rare. It's very rarely in the news. It's more common than it is in the news. But I think we should always think about politics as whatever governments are doing, it's in the anticipation of what they can get away with and what kind of things are going to be likely to trigger protest or not. And that depends in part on memory and what's happened in the past, and the muscle memory of protesters. So I have one local question for you guys and then one kind of global question, kind of about youth more generally. So it's a little bit directed to Martha because she was focusing more on the youth question. But so I wonder, are there, given your expertise in the regions you study, are there countries where youth are just more primed to protest, more kind of accustomed to protest, more inclined to? So, we're in a university campus, right? We all know some universities have a protest culture that more than others, right? It's the same thing with countries, right? And I just wonder among youth. So certainly, in my region, in Indonesia, youth know what their job is. They know it's their job, and it's especially with these kind of triggering events. They get out. It's their job to basically push back against these things. So I wonder if you could give us any flavor of that. Is there any way that there's some interesting local variation, like different countries in your region? And then more of a global question. So there's all this, I don't know if it's evidence or if it's just vibes, but there's this discourse now that youth are increasingly like not so pro-democratic. And so I wonder if to the extent that we're seeing this any kind of way, or certainly a significant amount of youth protest, how might we square these things? Is this, again, they're consistent because they're both signs of dissatisfaction, or no, there's not really anti-democratic and we can see this as, I guess there are a lot of ways of thinking about it, but given that and all the skepticism and cynicism about, well, youth are really becoming either apolitical or even anti-democratic, might these protests give us some pause to make think about that differently?
You just want to hear me and Martha.
I never want fights. I never want fights.
Quickly with the country variation, I mean, I think it's interesting because the countries that have the highest birth rates in sub-Saharan Africa, so Somalia, Chad, Mali, Niger, it's not that they don't have protests, but these are not the countries where we've seen the most significant protests recently. I mean, Kenya, South Africa, Senegal has a fair amount of protests, but they do the high birth rate. But like, Kenya, South Africa, Namibia, and those countries have relatively, for the region, low birth rate, and they're still high birth rates compared to, Korea or something. But I think that's quite interesting that those are quite repressive regimes in some dimensions, or almost failed states. I would say there are some countries that have a reputation. So Senegal, a country I know best, Kenya, South Africa, etc. Nigeria, yeah. But I would feel like in the 90s, or in the third wave, it's like 70% of countries have nonviolent regime transitions that are spurred on by nonviolent protests, right? And so I'm hesitant. It's not that there are any countries we would say there has not been some tradition of protests, but so in Senegal, when the previous president was attempting to go for a third term, which was exactly what his predecessor had done when youth protests had cleared the way for him to actually win, then he tries the exact same thing. I think that Senegalese youth really take it as like a badge of honor. Like, we've done this before, like we know there's sort of like a sense of capacity that they have, and people really mobilize. And there was a lot of repression. I don't want to sort of say that this was all rainbows and glory, but I think that they really do hold his feet to the fire. And now we see this pretty leftist party in power that I think the establishment elite were very nervous about, and they completely bungle any effort that they have to sort of maintain their grip on power, and like they lose. And I think youth play a big role in that, just like they did with Yana Mach in 2011, 2012, just like they did when Abdoulaye Wade first wins in 2000, et cetera. So I think there are countries where there's a real sense of like pride in that we could look to. But I don't know if it's that we don't see it everywhere. Although, I'm hard pressed to think of like a Somali protest movement that I've heard of, right? But maybe there might be cases.
Sudan
That's
right.
Enormous. Then you see this very significant coalescence.
But they did have models of
protest,
right. Even though they weren't necessarily visible to us.
Yeah. And if you want to jump in before we go on to democracy.
Yeah, just in this question. Yep. So I do. So I have just the paired examples that come to mind in Latin America, and then a broader theoretical point. I take a place like Argentina, where protests are constant. This country has a tradition of protesting. And so, and I'd say in many ways, this is the old school type of protest. It's led by traditional organizations like unions, even if they are sometimes joined, supplemented by the rest of the population. And I'll say one thing about Argentina: they can shift policy in specific ways. In fact, the latest example is protests that occurred during Milei's very aggressive set of policies initially. And they didn't win entirely. Some of these reforms they passed, but they were softened a little bit. Another example in that space would be Mexico, I'd say. Even at times where the regime was not completely democratic, protests they were tolerated, and some policy concessions are offered immediately. And the contrasting case would be Cuba, where protest is heavily repressed. Such that very mild expressions of dissatisfaction carry the heaviest consequences for dissenters. And we haven't seen a successful mass movement in Cuba just yet that goes all the way to toppling the regime. And this is where I take a step back. just descriptively, if one takes a measure of repressiveness by regimes and compares very repressive regimes to not so repressive regimes, and this is related but not exactly the same as the political regime, so this need not be democracies, but just countries that allow protests to occur, you see that you observe a higher, very obviously, a higher incidence of protest among those regimes that allow these expressions relative to regimes that repress it. But when you have a mass movement in a highly repressive regime, the likelihood of the regime falling just goes through the roof. It is much, much higher than in regimes that routinely allow protests to happen. And so the example that I have in my mind is not from my region, is Tunisia. Mm-hmm. So you have similar levels of protest activity by these data sets in Tunisia and in Mexico by the time of the Arab Spring, but Mexico allows this to happen all the time.
It's Wednesday.
Exactly. The tactics of the police are, I would say, even mild in comparative standards, and nothing happens. They get some policy concessions here and there. This protest happened in Tunisia, and you have a regime falling apart. And the theoretical reason I think that explains that is that protests in a setting like Tunisia's, or Cuba for that matter, are much more informative to everyone in society than a protest in a place like Mexico or Argentina. So if I'm sitting in my living room and see that people are taking to the Zócalo in Mexico City, I'm like, well, there are like 1,000 reasons why they would do it. They're probably gonna be fine. At worst, they're gonna be beaten up a little bit and they're gonna go home. If I observe that in Havana and I see a mass movement out in the streets, I'm like, okay, things are happening. Like people are willing to take the risk. And so that serves as a powerful enticement for coordination. Anyway, I can move on to the second.
Yeah, so I mean, let me respond to a couple of Dan's questions and then maybe try to get us to tax as well, which I think of. I really liked Francisco's comments about thinking about coordination devices and how a small grievance can be a trigger for activating a whole bunch of other grievances. So on Dan's questions about histories, I mean, I started my career as a scholar of protest movements, and repertoires of contention matter, right? Like people are always looking for models, they're drawing on legacies of protest in their own countries. But I think like grievances, these histories are oversupplied, right? We sort of find them everywhere. In Africa, you had a huge wave of third term protests earlier in the 2000s, almost everywhere. And so, there is a repertoire there. The second thing that I can say is, you talk to protest organizers and they're always referencing models from other countries as well. And especially with the spread of social media, they're going to be exposed to a lot of the tactics used elsewhere. I think maybe what your question is getting to is there some kind of mobilizing structure like latent there that could be activated? And I think that this gets to the question of social media. So I feel like I've spent about 15 years of my life saying, no, you can't use Twitter as a mobilizing structure in Africa because internet penetration is just too low. And I remember particularly having these arguments in DC with policy people around Balaid Citoyen in Burkina in 2016, 2017, 2014. Oh, really? See, again, to underline my point, no, it was just not that far in 2014. But now I think we're getting to a point where, we actually could see these things as mobilizing structures, but we want to be cautious about it. So by the time that Lauren Young and I were doing surveys around the time of the 2018, we did a panel survey in Zimbabwe around the 2018 elections, we were able to recruit people for follow-up surveys on WhatsApp. It was everywhere, particularly amongst people younger than 35. However, that piece, I mean, our analysis actually showed that in terms of shaping protest intentions, getting exposure to, social media reports or videos or anything about government repression of protesters or about just protest activity, that had no effect on people's protest intentions. Seeing it themselves in the flesh and having, a firsthand report did actually generate. So I think we want to be cautious about what social media can do. I do want to get us to tax though, because I think that the triggering event here that is important is we are in a context in which many low and middle income countries are facing new constraints and being forced to actually think about how to make their budgets sustainable over time. And a lot of these governments have been overwhelmingly reliant on both taking out more international debt loans, but also on international aid. And since COVID, they have gotten a very clear signal from bilateral donors and also from the IFIs, the international financial institutions, that they can't rely on that anymore, and that they're going to have to learn to tax their own populations. So I love this incident of like, you know, the metro fare reminds everyone of all of this stuff that they're really angry about. A lot of these large scale protests are over things like that, value added tax. And I work in the informal sector. Like, what proportion of informal sector firms are actually paying their like required VAT remission to the government? It's like very small. So I think that there's a possibility that tax, because it's very concrete, it may give this kind of a protest organizer, a civil society member, a social movement leader, it might give them something tangible that they can hang all of these other grievances about government corruption on. Like, look, they're not delivering, look at your social services, but now they're asking us to pay more in terms of property tax or VAT, or they're going to try to collect the new direct taxes, or they just removed our fuel subsidy, they just removed our electricity subsidy. I mean, a lot of this is also subsidies. And the reason they're removing those is because they're absorbing an enormous amount of public expenditure. Yeah. So in Nigeria, there was a huge protest that forced the government 10, 15 years ago to rescind an attempt to get rid of the fuel subsidy. At that point in time, it was absorbing 25% of government revenues in Nigeria. And now 2 years ago, the new president finally got rid of the fuel subsidy. And I don't even know why, but no one protested about that. So it's like these subsidies are a big reason that people are feeling the pain, but I think they may also serve as like this coordinating device for bigger grievances.
I think that's right. I do think there's I would broaden this a bit to say, I think there's just a general grievance around financial decisions of governments, right? So I mean, like Morocco is another case that has had very significant protests in the last month or two that's also been labeled as a Gen Z protest. I mean, and there the grievance is really, you know, the government, they're going to host the Africa Cup of Nations, and like, so they're building out these stadiums, they're building like billions of dollars worth of stadiums and a high-speed train and all these things for this very prestige, athletic diplomacy or whatever we're calling it. And you know, the mobilizing trigger was the stories that came out and quickly spread on social media about there's a series of women who died in one hospital in Agadir during childbirth. And so this story quickly spreads and becomes this sort of like flashpoint of, well, why you're spending all of this money on these stadiums when we have this like completely decaying health sector, right? And so I think I completely agree with the tax point, but I think that it's not just about pressure from debt, it's just general dissatisfaction with how governments are managing and spending money. And so, I mean, in Senegal, this isn't really related as much to a trigger. I think in many parts of West Africa, I mean, I think there's sort of this like almost, I don't think it's just purely colonialism or anti-neocolonialism. It's like almost like this neo-sovereigntism, right? Where it's like, wow, you know, who's controlling how we're spending this gas revenue and who negotiated those contracts? And this really fuels protests and rising opposition, or sometimes coup leaders use this as justification, right? About there's a real ability to tap into a well of discontent that like it's not just the debt burden, but there's just a broader way that elites have engaged and profited from a set of financial arrangements that are not in line with sort of like the needs of the population, and that sort of allow the government to sort of, you know, skim enormously and sort of not help people. So I think it's I completely agree that taxation is a trigger, but I think there's just it's not just cost of living. I mean, I think there's just a general sense these systems are not being made to work.
Made for two finger. I think infrastructure projects
Yeah.
are like a huge flashpoint, at
Right.
least in sub-Saharan Africa. But I will relate it to public finance
Yeah.
because a lot of those infrastructure projects are funded by the bridge. What is it? The
Yeah,
bridge
China.
and
And
road.
the Chinese debt
bri-
is all coming due.
the Chinese debt.
Yeah.
They were able to fund these infrastructure projects with Chinese debt. But now China is like, if you're not going to pay us back in hard currency,
Yeah.
then we want to take
Yeah.
some of your stuff. And then that sort of ties into
Yeah.
this, like, who has control over our country's resources.
So I wanna try to answer Dan's question about attitudes among younger generations around democracy. Before, just a footnote, because I want to mention this as we talked about the role of social media and these new information technologies on protests and how they help to coordinate protests in some situations. And at the time I was working on the topic, we were informed by similar headlines to what we see now in Gen Z, but this was around the time of the Arab Spring. And there was a lot of optimism about these technologies to coordinate collective action. We've tempered some of that optimism. I think, Adrienne, you mentioned this interesting description of what does and what does not generate, backlash.
Yeah.
The second way in which that literature has progressed is in how the governments have adapted to these technologies. And so even as social media and cell phones can facilitate coordination and can facilitate the spread of evidence of government repression, all of which push towards easier coordination of protests, they also provide a ready surveillance tool for governments. And so I find it telling that some of the research in political science, in very interesting research, I should say, has used this super fine-grained cell phone data that is made available to some researchers by the cell phone carriers themselves, which allow relatively precise positioning of people. And this research, of course, goes through all sorts of filters, so that data is not it's anonymized, and researchers don't know exactly who they're dealing with in data sets, and has produced some interesting work on networks, because you have information of who is calling whom and where they are and so forth. If researchers have access to this data, one has to assume that security apparatuses do too, and are going to use them towards identifying networks of opposition and basically suppressing them before they can even successfully organize a movement. And so that has been, I think, now recognized in the latest work in this space that I've seen out in the field. So anyway, just wanted to mention that, because it was, I felt like it would have been an incomplete picture when we discussed cell phones and social media. To Dan's question on preferences, when it comes to this new generation, I'd say a very partial view from Latin America. I'd say that the jury's out, in my view, in the region. So we have voting patterns that do suggest that in some countries you see a more right-wing reactionary youth. In countries like Brazil, for example, Bolsonaro received strong support from this younger cohort. You also see their participation in the Bolsonaro-led protests after he lost the election to Lula. You see also somewhat similar patterns in Argentina, so though I think a little bit less clear. And as I was reading up on all the details of this new wave of protests in Peru, I found interestingly that despite not having clear leadership and being sort of a decentralized and seemingly spontaneous protest movement, this latest one that's ongoing, there is already a lot of infighting among would-be student leaders precisely along these lines. And so you have some leaders, would-be leaders, I should say, that have been identified as having right-wing associations And that has created a debate among this protest movement. Now, I find that interesting in its own because it's not something that I would have expected 10 years ago. I think it would have been an obvious conclusion to an observer to think that any would-be leaders would be left of center in Latin American protests. And now we have some instances where it is not necessarily the case. And so I don't know if this marks a change in trend, but it is something interesting that I hadn't picked up on before in Latin America.
Weigh in on that a little bit.
Well, no, I mean, I was looking at some of the data in that for Barometer on my flight today. And I mean, I do think that youth remain committed to democratic norms. So if the, that for a Barometer asks a series of questions, I don't have a good example off the top of my head, but should we consider the government to be the boss, or is it the employee of the citizen? So that's a paraphrase, but there's questions like this, in round 9. And so they have a series of questions to sort of get at people's sense of accountability and what leaders and relation between leaders and citizens. And their youth are generally much, okay, I don't want to say much more, but they are more, more positive towards sort of accountability type models that we would think would lie at the heart of democracy. Their satisfaction of democracy in many countries is lower. They're voting less. They have lower, these classic vehicles that we think are how democracy works, like party, attachment to party ID, that's lower. But I don't have a sense from looking at that data that there's a radical move away from democratic norms. They're equally likely as older respondents. Of course, I did look, I don't remember now the exact, and there's some variation across countries, but on average, they're equally likely as older cohorts to reject one-man rule and one-party rule. They are 20% on average less likely to sort of reject military rule. And I think here is where there's some room for concern. Not that there's only room for concern, but I think that's the clearest outlier that I looked at the Afrobarometer briefing papers of the latest round. They also really highlight this as well. And so I don't want to say that they're 100% pro-democratic, but I don't think that they don't ascribe. I mean, I think one thing that the sort of source of frustration is a perceived lack of accountability and a lack of responsiveness from the system. And so I think there's the demand is there. I think one open question, as I'm good friends with Natalie Letza. She has a new book out and she looks at partisanship under autocracies. And one thing she finds is that in, strongholds, so she's looking in Cameroon, in Bia's strongholds, those people, they think they live in a democracy. They're oh yeah, we vote. This is a democracy, right? And it's only in opposition strongholds, these very minority sectors, that people are this is not a democracy. This system is totally rigged, right? Which is, in line with every international observer's view. And so I think there's this open question of do people, what percent of youth in Africa are frustrated by the system, but they think that this is what democracy has to offer. And they might know it works better elsewhere, but they don't have an experience with it, right? And I think there might be a bit of a mismatch there in sort of what because they didn't grow up they weren't alive in the 80s when these regimes when they actually had extremely repressive military regimes, right? So I don't know, it's something I'm still sort of thinking through, but yeah.
So I will agree and disagree. So Afrobarometer data, very well summarized. I think, no one is happy on the African continent with the way that democracy is working. Youth are probably more unsatisfied. There also is a general erosion in terms of hardcore normative belief that democracy is the best system and growing acceptance of military rule and stuff like that. I work mostly in unplanned urban settlements, which are also sometimes called slums. And I've been running surveys in these slums since, I guess, 2010. And one of the things that I always noticed is that our slum samples look really different than even the Afrobarometer urban samples. So you want to keep in mind that these general trends are national, it's not urban, right? And if we're thinking of Gen Z protests as mostly about urban youth, then I think that we might see, very much clearer trends. And again, I've never looked at this by age. What I can tell you is that my populations tend to be more likely when asked that is democracy the best system. There are two sort of responses that the Afrobarometer allows you, which is yes and no. And then there is a unread but coded response, which is for someone like me, democracy doesn't matter. And the rates in my urban samples of that response are like way, way higher. And I think that that would be really interesting to break down whether there is growing sort of, disenchantment, disillusionment. And that might be explaining why young people are voting in Africa at much lower rates. I will say qualitatively, there is definitely a movement, and you hear this actually amongst urban youth who are the most networked, the ones that are on all of the platforms and immediately upon meeting me, friend me on Facebook. And also, are interested in creating grassroots NGOs and can you connect me to donors? Those people are, I think, very interested in authoritarian developmental models. Mm-hmm. So they will mention China, they will mention Rwanda, they will mention Ethiopia, even Tanzania under Magufuli. They will mention these as democracy is not working for us. We need a different model. These authoritarian states are offering a different model that we think would be better for development. And I think that goes hand in hand with this criticism of clientelism. I mean, the amount of disenchantment, especially, I spend a lot of time in Lagos, especially in Lagos. It's like every single politician is a crook. There's no way you can reform this system. We need to get rid of all of them. So I do think that we see that even in the protests. So I think if you look at, I just watched the media coverage, right? But if you look at the interviews on the street with the Senegalese protesters more recently versus the ones back in, the earlier WAD, anti-WAD protest, they are speaking a different language. I think the earlier ones were saying much more things about making democracy better, whereas these more recent ones, at least if the French news media is to believe, and they might be cherry picking, right? But they're more likely to say stuff like, we need to burn it all down.
Yeah. I'll just say, just briefly to wrap it up, as I hear what you're saying, I wonder, this speaks to a skepticism that I think I have when I see these questions about preferences for democracy, tying it to my thoughts on political preferences in Latin America among the youth. I wonder if it's not just a reaction against what's offered in the status quo, and we are interpreting it literally as it's asked. So some of these younger voters in Brazil that support Bolsonaro, because we saw what Bolsonaro eventually tried to do, we may attribute it as a preference, for an authoritarian system, when in fact it's just a reaction to the prior left-wing government that comes in a bundle. Similarly, when people get asked, do you prefer a democracy or a non-democracy, their point of reference is where they live. And so if where they live is a democracy and they don't like what they see, they may respond that they don't like it. But I don't know that the obvious thing is to interpret that as these people have no democratic values. I don't know. I think it's a hard measurement problem to solve.
People are always weighing these things, right? So, I think there is a natural human impulse to have civil liberties and political freedoms. There's a natural, democracy is appealing. And I think all of the stuff written in the 1990s and 2000s about Africans' intrinsic desire for democracy, I think all of that stuff holds. But I think now they're like, listen, we had expectations. And we need to see economic development, we need to see jobs creation, we need to see all these other things. And maybe we're open to trading off some liberties in order to get these other things. And I think when I talk to urban youth who are mentioning Ethiopia, Rwanda, China, when they're mentioning these models, they're not saying, I want to live in an authoritarian regime, right? They're saying, I want some of the development that I think is happening there, and I may be willing to trade off. I think
Okay, excellent. If you have small bottles of water to parch your state, you must be parched after all this commentary. Well supplied, well hydrated. Anybody want to question from the audience at this point?
we also have to ask the people.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, please, thank you for the thought. So if this is kind of like a Netflix question. But for the examples you mentioned where there has been really substantive impact, like in the fall, they've hit midterm government. Whole government's been kind of disarray, right? You see the kind of impulse for a change leading to, or do you think that if it can be like a technocratic government could make it? That it's kind of really a toss up, or do you think it's just some kind of management? Like, are they fed up with just the conditions, or is it more of a systemic thing? Like, I don't want another class of politicians, I want more politicians, right?
I'm not sure if I understand you correctly. I mean, I think they're getting the same class of politicians, right? I mean, so in Madagascar, I mean, the military CAPSAT, the like elite military unit that took over, and they're the exact same unit that put the previous Rajoelina in power in the coup he first came to power in 2009, right? And so like they're protecting their interests. And I think this is one downside. I mean, I think one downside of the very decentralized nature of these protests is that even when you have groups that are strongly associated with them, like Le Balai Citoyen in Burkina Faso, those groups are sort of really, they really don't want to enter government, but they were very self-conscious about not wanting to sort of come in and sort of assume the mantle. But as a result, I mean, I don't want to blame them, they did a lot, but I mean, as a result, I think there's a sort of vacuum once, Campori, flees, you have this new space. They do, the military takes over briefly and they transition to elections, but now they've had a series of coups, right? And so I think because they're so decentralized and because they're not mapping themselves onto opposition parties, which I understand because opposition parties are often just like the same elites, like they're not really a viable alternative, but you don't see anything emerging, at least in sub-Saharan Africa, that is channeling or representing these grievances. And so I think this is why you sort of see these repeated protest waves and a lot of increasing instability, because who's going to seize power? Often it's the military, and they're often doing it to protect their own interests. I mean, the military is like the Ugandan, I mean, this isn't it, they haven't had a protest movement, but like, in countries like Uganda, and the military is like deeply embedded with them, they're making a ton of money, right? And so, and this is true across the continent. And so I don't think they might like the idea of the military is coming in, but I don't believe the Burkina Faso are like thrilled with where they are now.
It's just a problem of recycled elites or military rule. It's also a problem of populism. Right. And that's why I think what Francisco is saying about, models in Latin America, like in Africa, we're like, well, there aren't any strong parties. Yeah. I think even if there were trade unions that were coordinating protests, even if there were parties, I feel like we're living in a moment when those institutions don't seem to be channeling demands in a way that results in substantive change. I don't know.
I mean, I without knowing about
Malay,
the Nepalese case,
yes,
which
we need their we brought it right back to that.
I think as a general question about the effect of protests when they do topple an administration, I think I really don't have a clear answer when the question is stated in that at that level of abstraction. So protests that topple regimes lead to all types of outcomes. And I think we do know as a discipline a little bit more about the conditions that make a transition to democracy more likely in the presence of mass protests. And I think some of the explanation has to do with the structure of political institutions and elite power. You have one incumbent group that's stepping down, and sometimes the conditions are ripe for a pact that establishes a foundation for electoral democracy. That tends to be, is a great outcome, but not perhaps the most obvious one in all countries. And so it depends on what is the situation in a specific country. And again, in the case of Nepal, I don't know enough to make even an informed guess.
Based on reading like 10 newspaper articles, I will say continuity in Nepal. But I think in most of these places, it's going to be continuity. You did mention technocrats, and we do have a few examples of explicitly sort of politicians coming in with an explicitly technocratic agenda. But I would say even in that category, we have ones that seem to succeed. Kagame is often pointed to, and Rwanda is one of these. Fashola in Lagos. But there are a lot of examples of these people coming in and actually trying to do their technocratic agenda, but having to do it in a very authoritarian way, and then getting backlash, and you end up with a non-result as well. So just underline, there's just tons of variation.
I mean, just to give an example, it's not quite the same situation, but I mentioned the protests in Guatemala. And there, what you had was the very real possibility of essentially a coup. And so the country is not, at the time of the Arevalo transition, was not recognized as being a very strong democracy. But they were about to stop a duly elected president from taking office under very thin pretext. And the mass mobilization, I would say in that case, made that option impossible for the incumbent elites. And so in that case, mass mobilization pushed towards the consolidation of democracy, let's say, at least, on the margin in the Guatemalan case.
Like Senegal, we would generally agree that that's happened in Senegal as well.
Positive notes. Well, let's go ahead and end it there. Thanks. This is a really remarkable conversation. Great set of comments and interactions. I want to really thank Rosa and Dina for setting everything up. And
yes,
thanks to Francisco Garfias, Martha Wilfahrt, and Adrienne LeBas for carrying us through this fascinating topic. Thank you all.